Under Trump administration and the recent measures that they have announced, what is the state of the liberal order right now?
The liberal order, as we have known it for 80 years, is now being passed into its grave. We are entering a new phase. This decade is a decade of turbulence and transition, which you can call a neo-mercantilism.
What is the future of IMF and World Bank amidst two key trends? Declining US interest in multilateralism on one hand, and the emergence of alternative multilateral financial institutions like BRICS and SCO.
If you see the defunding of US aid as a sign that there's going to be defunding of even larger bodies, then perhaps the IMF and the World Bank are seeing their last days.
The de-dollarization, and Mr. Trump issued a stern warning against BRICS that anybody who indulges in de-dollarization is going to be completely denied the US export market. What does this mean for India, China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa?
If you get enough partners to de-dollarize simultaneously, the United States won't be able to stop them. Tariffs were considered something old-fashioned and dead. There are no economists who say tariffs are a good idea. I don't know anywhere across the spectrum, because it's like alchemy. It's a dead idea being revived, and it's shown not to work.
The Human Development Index and the liberal agenda is going to survive Trump's presidency in the developing world?
It won't, but the development goals can be achieved by all countries now. This is the truth we now realize, that a country such as ours, like Pakistan, has the resources to fill the gap that US aid has been doing.
There is going to be perhaps a greater expectation that the US market access might cost us something in return. What does this mean for Pakistan, and how should we address these challenges in the years to come?
And all of these countries will have to decide whether they should continue to patronize an elite that is not looking in the same direction as they are. Pakistan also must consider this question very deeply about where its interests lie in such a hostile, brazenly neo-mercantilist world.
Viewers, very warm welcome to another episode of V News English program Perspectives, in which we bring before you a very insightful and informed analysis of some of the most interesting and important developments unfolding around the world. Viewers, currently the world is witnessing with bated breath some of the most significant changes which are unfolding in the global economy, global finance, global trade, tariff wars, de-dollarization. And I think this is making the world worried, but also a fascinating workplace. So in order to understand and make sense of this all, we have together joined today by one of the leading experts on the subject, Dr. Usman Chohan, who has authored many books and continues to be a thought leader on the world economy. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Saab.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So let's begin by asking you a basic question that for almost 80 years, the US took pride in itself as the preeminent spearhead of liberal values, liberal order, and the so-called, rules-based order. Under Trump administration and the recent measures that they have announced, what is the state of the liberal order right now?
The liberal order, as we have known it for 80 years, is now being passed into its grave. We are entering a new phase. This decade is a decade of turbulence and transition, where the liberal order does not have any natural defenders, nobody at the vanguard like it used to. That is because you have a new system in America embodied by Trump in 2016 and now since 2025, which you can call a neo-mercantilism. This is the new order, which is actually a very old order. It's how the 16th century powers used to compete. Scramble for Africa attitude, cutting up the world map, trying to gain as much for your immediate gains at the expense of others. So a zero-sum game mentality where you want to beggar thy neighbor rather than seeking mutual gains, and you want to extract the maximum from direct use of force, threats, and blackmail rather than having vassals working indirectly for you as part of a system. So the values that underpinned the liberal world order, such as democracy, freedom, etc., those are now, they don't have any more defenders, many major defenders. And so I think that this is now a system that has seen its way to the end because the American people over the last 40 years did not see as much of the gains from this liberal world order because neoliberalism crept in and the gains to the people started to disappear or flatten out. The first half of the liberal world order was characterized by FDR's plans for the economy, which tried to share the gains, have a large middle class, have empowerment of people. It also was accompanied by the civil rights movement. All of these attitudes were strengthening Americans. But that and the GI Bill and the education of the people, the Great Society, all of these American programs made it quite a strong country. But then private power reared its head in the Reagan era particularly, and it wanted to revert it to the Gilded Age. Now we are in that Gilded Age, and the frustration of that has meant that people in general are willing to see American foreign policy, as well as its domestic policy, act in a mercantilist manner to make up for 40 years of lost time, where their wages have been stagnant. Now their social programs are being cut. The big tech is so large. Wall Street has a huge impact. And that's why they think this is the cure to their sickness. But it isn't.
But let me ask you a follow-up question based on what you just said. Does this mean that the Western-led so-called liberal order is collapsing, imploding, or only its leadership is likely to shift from North America to Western Europe?
You can argue that Western Europe feels like it needs a new leader. Their leaders have said so. The state
and European Union leader has said so.
Exactly.
Perhaps Europe needs to take on the helm affairs and rise to the challenge and lead the liberal world.
Yes, they have made tweets and statements that say that the free world needs a new leader. But is it possible for any of these countries alone to assume that mantle? Probably not, because all of this liberal world order, this intersectional imperialism, has been underpinned by the aircraft carrier and the atomic bomb. And so without that military heft, without a Wehrmacht backing Germany's new liberal attitude, or a similar thing with the French legionaries backing France's strength, you aren't going to see that translated, because people themselves in these societies, as well as external observers in other countries, don't buy that attitude anymore unless you have this mask of liberalism for direct power. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense to them.
Now, I want you to briefly comment on some of the key pillars of the so-called Western liberal order. One was the United Nations, which represented a multilateral diplomatic forum to resolve and manage crises and conflicts. A second most important pillar was the World Bank and IMF system, which allowed the newly independent states economic assistance and relief through multilateral financial institutions. What is the future of IMF and World Bank amidst two key trends? Declining US interest in multilateralism on one hand, and the emergence of alternative multilateral financial institutions like BRICS and SCO.
If you see the defunding of US aid as a sign that there's going to be defunding of even larger bodies, then perhaps the IMF and the World Bank are seeing their last days. The IMF itself has struggled for relevance in the last 10 years because it has found very few clients for what it is selling, which is distressed financial bailouts. Many countries have decided to construct their own austerity programs in crises. Malaysia did it in 1997, so did after the baht crisis, so did Korea. Generally, the trend was that whatever IMF was selling, the world wasn't buying. And only a few client states which are hostage to the IMF's dictums because they simply haven't done enough internal reform, Ukraine, Argentina, Kenya, Pakistan, everybody, and Sri Lanka now, everybody else has decided that we don't want what they're selling because the gains from their bailout are so small relative to the cost to society of their austerity program. So already it was in trouble. Trump can easily say that this IMF is actually doing all of this other deep state stuff, which is how he accused the US aid also. His people laid out all the programs that was involved in. He can make a similar argument for the destructive character of the World Bank and IMF, even though the World Bank has a very nice soft corner and soft image, and so did US aid with some good programs. IMF in particular has a very ruthless character when it comes to the austerity that it imposes, and there's a long track record of that. If this is the case, then there are other institutions which are stepping up or being formed now, which are well capitalized or shall be well capitalized to do the emergency distressed lending or distressed bailout actions that are required. You have the BRICS Bank, you have the AIIB, you may have an SEO bank in the future. There's plenty of that. But also in a mercantilist system, you may have the private banking systems or the vulture capitalists, as they're called, stepping in a larger sense and providing capital for much larger gains, which won't make societies better. It'll just be a different person extorting the money. Rather than sitting in Washington, it'll be somebody in New York. So this fundamental character of exploitation in capitalism globally should still exist. It will still exist.
Let me draw your attention on another very important trend that the world is witnessing. While Mr. Trump has clearly made or means no words about using tariff as a coercive instrument of foreign policy against friends and foes alike, which has worried people in India, which has worried people in China, which has worried European Union. What do you make of this, and how it is likely to be understood and responded by China and important strategic partners like, Western Europe and India?
Mm-hmm. It's an excellent question because it has many dimensions. There's the US dimension internally. Then there is the foes and there are the friends. Three camps that you can look at.
But do you think Trump is going to distinguish between them?
He will make sweeping measures because tariffs itself by their character are sweeping.
Because his behavior has unnerved friends and foes alike.
Correct. It's a very sweeping attitude. And to be honest, tariffs were considered something old-fashioned and dead. There are no economists who say tariffs are a good idea. I don't know anywhere across the spectrum, because it's like alchemy. It's a dead idea being revived and it's shown not to work, because a tariff is a tax on your own people. And that's why you won't have foreigners paying it. And the other thing is you'll get retaliation. So when your exporters export abroad, they will be paying, or it's exporting less or lose out to a competitor, depending on the situation. The tariffs are considered bad. For domestic reasons, I think the American people are going to start to find Trump more and more unpopular because they already went through a bout of inflation, very bad inflation, things like egg prices, house prices, everything. They don't quite understand that they are the ones who are going to be paying. It's not in the common narrative. And when things get 20% more expensive, 40% more expensive, then Trump might have to back off just because of the domestic pressure. On the foes, the big foes, our competitors are China, above all. And against China has its own arsenal, and it has a track record of being very clever, very agile in striking back at America. For example, in 2016, when the US tried to do aggressive measures against China in this protectionist character, China simply struck at red states, the Republican voting states having tariffs or duties or other difficulties, encumbrances put on those. So ketchup from Kentucky or things like that. And so these states then had economic crises and they lobbied Trump to back off. So China can do very targeted things in an effective manner. As for the friends, you might say that some of their friends are doomed. For example, Canada, only let's say 10 to 20% of US trade is with Canada. But 80% of Canada's trade is with the US.
So even with Mexico, I think?
Correct. It's the same roughly volume where 80% of Mexico's trade goes to the United States, even if it's not so large the other way.
India is worried. I think they have more than $47 or $48 billion worth of exports to the US.
That's right. That's right. And even for a country like Pakistan, which runs a surplus against the US of about $3 billion, it might be an issue. But for Canada, then so far, their leadership has found that there's more political gains from taking a tough stance, because Canadians are of a much sterner metal than the Americans realize. Canadians and Americans have gone to war before. It was the Canadians that burnt the White House. And Trudeau's most recent statement says, we won't back down from a fight. So they have this fierce... You must be of a particular character yourself to be able to make Canadians angry. And Trump has successfully made Canadians mad. And so they can find ways to strike, and they will absorb the pain. They have this character in Canada of absorbing the pain for the right cause or for the right reason. So maybe Trump doesn't realize, he thinks these are junior partners or little neighbors, but they actually can be very fierce. In Mexico, their president, Sheinbaum, she has a popularity of 80% among the voters. That is higher than Trump has ever had in the United States. So she can mobilize her people to withstand this. But what happens to the immediate near abroad of America when these countries become hostile? Perhaps Canada thinks of joining the European Union. Perhaps Mexico focuses much more on Latin America. This isolation can be far more damaging, because the last people you should be attacking is the allies who have put their lives on the line in the past to advance common interests. That's right.
So your brief comment on the de-dollarization, and Mr. Trump issued a stern warning against BRICS that anybody who indulges in de-dollarization is going to be completely denied the US export market. What does this mean for India, China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa?
If you get enough partners to de-dollarize simultaneously, the United States won't be able to stop them. If you convert enough of your trade and you settle it in some other currency, the US can't stop you from settling in whatever currency you want.
I want you to briefly explain as a supplementary question, because at the same time, US is under Trump administration encouraging and facilitating the emergence of cryptocurrency as well. So does that not tantamount to indirectly endorsing de-dollarization?
Oh, that is a very interesting relationship, but that has to do more with internal corruption rather than external desires. Trump wants to have his cake and eat it too with dollar, because he says that countries have to run a deficit with America now, and they have to use the dollar. But the reason that the US has run a deficit historically is to facilitate global trade in the dollar. There has to be demand outside the US, so their demand plus your demand means there's a deficit. So he can't have it both ways. Simply the nature of trade will change into another currency. It may simply become barter trade if they're so worried about, if other countries are so worried about sanctions.
But I want your brief comment on, do you think that the popularity of cryptocurrencies, which we earlier also discussed, is going to pose a challenge to dollar dominance?
Perhaps not. What you're seeing is a linkage between crypto and dollar now. What you're seeing is that the US is now ready to put a strategic reserve, which means that it creates a demand of taxpayer money for this crypto. But the reason for that is not ideological. It is not for national interest. It's because the crypto people, the shadow people of crypto, have realized that it's better to get into politics and be nasty rather than work in the shadow. So they have removed many people from Congress. They have put money behind Trump. And what they want to do is create a demand for the supply of crypto they have so that they can cash out. If I have so much Bitcoin, I'm wealthy on paper, but I'll be much better off if I convert it into dollar. So they're waiting for some big buyer to come around so they can get rid of their crypto. And the US is going to handle or absorb that loss on their behalf. These are the people working around Trump. He has produced his own Trump coin, his Melania coin. This is all part of taking crypto totally out of its ideology for immediate and narrow gains. So that is linking the dollar at the expense of American taxpayer for the 1% to get even richer in dollar terms.
So while the Republicans are making a comeback in terms of, as some scholars have pointed out, that it's a reset. It's an ideological reset within the U.S. polity, that the left had enjoyed power, resources, influence for far too long. And now the right of center is fighting back in order for some course correction. But do you think the left within the U.S. has the political will, capacity, and influence to make all these measures politically costly for Trump administration?
It's a very powerful question, because in a two-party system, you need the opposing party to be very galvanized, very active. But the Democratic Party right now is responsible for the victory of the right. It's not that the demographics of America favor right-wing. Over time, since the 90s, people knew that the society would be going more and more left because there are more minorities, more young people, etc. But what has happened is that the Democratic Party has, with this face of intersectionality, promoted imperialism so blatantly, like you've seen in Palestine, like you've seen with all of this, that nobody has a stomach for this type of thing. So they have pushed them out. The actual wing of the Democratic Party, which can win easily with ordinary people, is the progressives. But it's the Democratic Party itself that has always marginalized the progressives, like AOC, like Bernie Sanders. So this impediment in a two-party system stops the actual desires of American people to rise up in a positive way. And the progressives are the future of America. This right-wing thing is a retaliatory or reactionary measure, but the demographics and society there does not favor right-wing attitudes. These white folk in general are going to die out demographically, but the progressives don't have an actual platform to advocate for the changes that America requires to actually be a strong country again.
But I agree with your view that actually Trump and Republican Party successfully exploited the mistakes of the Democrats and the leftist forces, rather than, offering a more superior plan. And when you witness that Biden administration actively supported the Gaza war, it was not very tolerant of the pro-Palestinian voices, and it failed to win the support of the immigrants, of the migrants and people of other color, races and religions. And recently what Mr. Trump has done is to shut down US aid, which has practically made most NGOs in the developing world and global south, including Pakistan, orphan, because they are going to be deprived of all the funding for all the promotion of the liberal agenda, whether it is feminism, whether it is LGBTQ, whether it is gender equality, whether it's higher education, whether it is anything regarding Human Development Index, which is basically a liberal agenda. So do you think the Human Development Index and the liberal agenda is going to survive Trump's presidency in the developing world?
It won't, but the development goals can be achieved by all countries now. This is the truth we now realize, that a country such as ours, like Pakistan, has the resources to fill the gap that US aid has been doing. I'll give you an example of an excellent program that US aid was funding, which was water purification in interior Sindh. Why doesn't the Sindh government just fund this once and for all and solve these issues? The truth is that we have a large NGO crowd which sits in Kosar market, and they are the biggest loss makers in this. But actually getting things down, Pakistan has the resources to solve that. And the truth is the same for all third world, because the third world isn't poor anymore. It's just very unequal.
But one of the Republican critics in a very sweeping statement has been alleging that it is the middle class of the US whose tax money gets to the NGOs which are run and managed by the elite of the developing country,
Exactly.
which does not reach the downtrodden and the poor people of the developing South. Is this a correct allegation?
This is precisely what I'm referring to with Kosar market, the most elite market in the city we reside in. It is precisely this critique that they then arbitrate among their interests with their ideology rather than having actual needs-based stuff. But again, it is the third world that can fund its own requirements now. The wealth and the resources exist now. We are not in the third world of the 60s, where you really did have desperate poverty when Kennedy made US aid in 1961. Now we have a different situation where we don't need US aid and we don't need its agenda. There are many color revolutions funded by US aid. There's much intervention in societies also by capturing the elite, as you just said. We don't need any of that. Instead, we have to drive our own development agendas. And one final point as an economist about development is that this whole industry, which includes the World Bank at a bigger level and not just US aid, is driven on the idea that these countries are poor, therefore we need to remain involved. The measure for poverty in 1960 was that you didn't have more than one meal a day. Today, the measure of poverty is that you don't have an air conditioner in every room.
You don't have internet access, probably.
You don't have internet. Poor you. But actually, that's the only way you can work the numbers to make these countries seem poor. If you look at the reality of your country versus when you were a child, the actual quality of life is very different. The only problem is it's unequal, and we want it to be more equal. That's all.
So my last question is that the developing world, and in Pakistan in particular, we have witnessed three key initial trends exercised by the Trump administration. We have seen a reluctance to sustain and support the development agenda. So there is a significant decline in the assistance, relief, and loans that we've traditionally expected from the US. The second is there's going to be growing coercion, not just on China, but all its major trading partners to dissuade them from investing in Chinese-funded projects. And thirdly, there is going to be perhaps a greater expectation that the US market access might cost us something in return. What does this mean for Pakistan, and how should we address these challenges in the years to come?
Pakistan struggles to maintain this balancing act between the US and China, not because China puts pressure, but because the US puts this pressure. Ideally, like China says, there is enough room for everybody to get along. But the coercion that you've mentioned with the US means that there's actually a bifurcation now in the interests. The elite of Pakistan, whomsoever they may be and however you may describe them, have an alignment to worship towards the West. But the agenda of the people's development is far more supported by trade with Asia, not just with China, but far more integration into the regional economies, including the Gulf, Central Asia, and China. So the people's interest is in one direction and the elites is in the other. And all countries that are in this situation are going to be miserable in this new mercantilist system. It includes Egypt, it includes Kenya, it includes Argentina. And all of these countries will have to decide whether they should continue to patronize an elite that is not looking in the same direction as they are. Pakistan also must consider this question very deeply about where its interests lie in such a hostile, brazenly neo-mercantilist world.
Dr. Chohan, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your very candid and insightful analysis and trying to help us understand and make sense of what's going on around the world, particularly in terms of the liberal order, the challenges it faces, and the wealth and the distribution of values and power around the world. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Viewers, this was another episode of V News English program Perspectives. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Don't forget to share your feedback and comments. And thank you for watching.